Hello and welcome to another episode of the Minor Issues Podcast. I'm Mark Thornton at the Mises Institute. Are stock market crashes and economic crises inevitable? I've had a couple of discussions lately based on my recent episodes of the podcast of whether or not President Trump is to be blamed for the next coming recession. He's not. Here's where friends have suggested that crashes and crises don't make any sense, and that it must be just something psychological or all just a big mistake. And to that I answer a qualified yes. Terrible things like crashes and crises are not inevitable and don't make common sense, and they are part psychological, and they are big mistakes. They are something that we can avoid. Let's start with a world with no crashes, no crises. That requires a free market economy with little or no state involvement, and certainly not any involvement of the state in money and banking. Crises and crashes require some intervention by the state or an economy-wide monopoly in banking, where more competitive banking is better. The state intervention must be able to generate some sort of leverage in banking and in the economy in general. The problem begins as this leveraging begins to occur, usually because the state is spending and borrowing large amounts of money. The state finds some way to induce an increase in the money supply and or increase in credit leverage by banks. The good time euphoria, however, can't last forever, and the new money starts to induce higher prices for assets, the stock market, real estate, higher prices for goods, and higher prices for resources like labor and raw materials. Eventually, all the projects that look so good on paper start to sour. Profits turn to losses and booms turn to bust. This is when crashes and crises can occur. There are other terrible economic events that might not qualify under this explanation. However, when we realize that wars are really boom-bust cycles mixed with mass killing and destruction of capital, that there isn't much left in modern history to discuss. I welcome your suggestions. Now, going back to the early days of state capitalism, the South Sea bubbles and the Mississippi bubble were generated in this same fashion, along with all subsequent stock market crashes and economic crises, war-related or not. Even the Dutch Tulip Bubble of 1637 has been explained as the result of government intervention into money and banking, notably by Douglas French in his book Early Speculative Bubbles and Increases in the Supply of Money. Not only does tulip mania stories have their origins in government intervention, they also suffer from the general tendency of being hyperbolic in their explanations and to be explained in very simplistic ways. Shivani, a data analyst at Genuine Impact, noted, quote, "The tulip mania, though over 3 centuries old, embodies the central themes of speculative behavior, irrational exuberance, societal status, and the painful aftermath of a burst bubble. The historical pattern cannot be mistaken. Crashes and crises are preceded by booms and bull markets. When placed in a proper economic context, the common feature is government intervention into money and banking. It would be hard to write a proper history of any business cycle without using the words inflation and deflation. Now, that doesn't stop economists, historians, and journalists from trying. Marxists, for example, will tell you that the cycle is the result of the profit motive and the exploitation of labor coming to a boil. But not why such dramatic events are not more regular in countries around the world and through time. In contrast to the hardwired features promulgated by the Marxist, Keynesian economists and journalists will tell you that it's man's fragile, unstable psychology is what leads entrepreneurs first head over heels into investments, only to be suddenly and globally running away from the animal spirits and headed for the hills. The general problem with all the various Keynesian perspectives and all the Marxist socialist perspectives on the business cycle is that they are really not scientific or based in any tangible way on economic analysis. In contrast, economists using monetary approaches to derive monetary explanations of cycles seem much closer to the truth. For example, Irving Fisher, the great progressive American economist, thought the market needed government to stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar. But when government gave itself the power to do so with the Fed, he had to admit that government caused the Great Depression. Milton Friedman thought likewise. He believed that the government and the Fed should be put in charge of money, but in the end, they caused the Great Depression, and Friedman admitted that, and they have regularly made mistakes, plucking the economy off its long-run growth trajectory into contractions ever since. This monetary group suggests possible imperfections in money and banking, where the government is already intervening in money and banking, but then goes on to suggest further government interventions and to admonish Fed officials and regulatory officials when things go awry between the internal contradictions between all of the various layers of government interventions. Fed officials typically only blame dead Fed officials. They claim to act within their legislative mandates and the powers that they are given. They always claim to be ready to save the day should some external force, technological shock, or unforeseen events materialize. That is a good story, and they stick to it. However, the fact that they never admit to being the cause of price inflation in the first place, or that they are supposed to prevent the initial monetary expansion that precedes all crashes and crises, suggests that they are not the white-knighted firemen, but rather are the loose-fingered arsonists who initiate the blaze and destruction in the first place. There is a well-known scientific reason for business cycles and the attendant asset crises, and economic crises and crashes in stock markets that is consistent, although it's not perfectly uniform, throughout modern history. That reason is government intervention or meddling in the economy, specifically with money and banking. Non-economic rationalizations of the cycles fail to explain why such cycles materialize only at certain times and places, and not at all times and places. Monetary explanations fail to explain changes in money and banking that is obvious in the historical record. Ignoring Murphy's Law and economic laws, bureaucratic rules have never prevented crashes or crises, but have only intensified their impacts. Only economies that are free of state intervention, particularly in money and banking, can be truly free of monetary and macroeconomic disturbances.